that if you have any interest in study with the Theology, Medicine, Culture Initiative, we have several formats that can take, including a new hybrid program that allows you to continue your work and living wherever you are, and come join us for a week in residence in August and a week in January to receive a certificate in theology and healthcare with flexible online work afterwards. We also have an immersive residential fellowship program of 1 or 2 years. Please visit our website, tmc.divinity.duke.edu, for further information about those programs. Now it's my distinct joy and pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. Keisha Bentley Edwards, who will be speaking with us today on the topic of the intersection of gender and denomination on cardiovascular disease risk factors for African Americans. Dr. Bentley Edwards is the Associate Director of Research for the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity, and she's an assistant professor here at Duke University School of Medicine in the Department of General Internal Medicine. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on how culture, gender, and racism influence healthy development throughout the lifespan. Her health equity-based research has been supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. Her current NIH projects examine the role of religion and religious coping on cardiovascular disease risk factors and dementia. She regularly shares her expertise on the role of structural racism and bias on health, education, and social outcomes with policymakers, practitioners, and the broader community. And on a personal note, I want to thank Dr. Bentley Edwards, who welcomed me when I was coming on board at Duke nearly 2 years ago, and was really generous and gracious with her time and helping me orient navigating both the School of Medicine and the wider university context. Dr. Bentley Edwards, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Brett. It's my pleasure. It was wonderful to be invited. I will be sharing my screen, and I'll try not to make the teacher sharing face that everyone likes to make jokes about on Zoom. All right, so today, I will, and everyone can see this, I'm assuming. I wanted to share the work that our team is making over at the Cook Center on religion and religion, spirituality, and cardiovascular disease risk factors. And so instead of talking about one specific paper, we have several studies and manuscripts that have recently been published. So I wanted to give a broad overview of the project because we're at a critical point where feedback is helpful, but also to share some of the promising results that we have. So it's not really unusual to talk about religion and health, and I'll give a project overview, give a few of the key findings and trends, and then I really wanted to have a nice, robust discussion. And so overall, it sounds pretty benign what we're looking at. We wanted to know what the role of religion and spirituality is on cardiovascular disease for African Americans. And that seems like, well, people have been looking at religion and health for a while. What makes this different? Why did NIH fund you on this project? Especially because NIH doesn't always like to fund religious-based work in this way. Well, here's the thing that makes this project somewhat unique is that this is focused exclusively on African Americans. So all the findings that you'll see here are on African Americans. So when we started digging in, and William Sandy Darity is my co-investigator on this project. When we looked through the studies, and I think what actually sparked his curiosity was the Seventh-day Adventist studies that were coming out on health and looking at the distinctions in the denominational distinctions in health. And the way that the study was set up is that you could compare white Adventists to other white people in a variety of religious affiliations. And then for the African Americans who were part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they were compared to the general Black population. And so they were healthier than the general Black population, but not as healthy as the Seventh-day Adventists that were part of their congregations. So, that really was a curious finding. But as we looked into more and more of the research, what we found is a fairly robust literature on the mental health benefits, the social benefits of religion for African Americans. But the more specific physical health, it was a bit all over the place. Some of it most of it was qualitative, but it wasn't as focused on the nuance of religion. And considering that African Americans have consistently been noted as the most religious group in America compared to whites and Latinos specifically, this is something that was of keen interest to us. And so we decided to look at 4 key factors or indicators for cardiovascular disease: obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and depression. And so for each of these diseases, you find that African Americans have a high prevalence or a higher health burden. So overall for cardiovascular disease, what you find is that there is a similar prevalence between Black and white individuals. However, the morbidity and the mortality is roughly twice that for African Americans, particularly when you look at first-time heart incidents. So this is something that was really a critical source of information. Like, we need to find this information and figure out what can be done to analyze this data better so that we can implement better interventions. And because faith-based health innovations and interventions is a growing strategy, this seemed like it was a really ripe. And my research interest looks at race, culture, gender, racism. And so this really tied into a lot of the work that I was already doing. So to get more into this project, we decided that we wanted it to be really robust. And so with that, we wanted to look at denominational differences, which is something we really weren't seeing. We wanted to see if we could find the similar directions as far as the research across multiple data sets. We also felt that there would be differences when we looked at the intersection of gender and denomination, because we knew that there were already some gender differences, for instance, in obesity and depression, where women have, Black women specifically have higher rates of obesity and depression in the general population. And then we also, I'm a developmental psychologist by training, so I'm always interested in how different stages of a person's life affects their health outcomes. And so that was interesting to me as well. And so with that in mind, and then obviously we're have the qualitative part. We're not going to talk as much about the qualitative part. Excuse me, I've been talking since about 8 o'clock this morning, and it's starting to catch up to me. So with that in mind, we have 2 overarching themes or aims. And we're going to focus more so on aim 1 at this moment. Just otherwise, this will be in here all day. And so identifying these the variables, organizing, determine these common attributes. And really, we wanted to look at the reason why we wanted to look at the denominations is we wanted to know, like, are there denominations that overall, especially based off of their doctrines, may be doing it a little bit better than others? And how can we share that wealth of knowledge, if we can share that wealth of knowledge, to other denominations? Our second aim, and so that was using secondary data. The second aim is qualitative, which we're in the midst of collecting that data right now. And that data is being collected from faith leaders in the form of interviews, and then focus groups for members of faith institutions. And so the secondary data sources: the National Survey of American Life, the national, and so NSAL is what you'll hear me referring to it, or NSAL. And that is a data set that is the largest data set solely of African Americans. We are using only the African Americans, and actually not just African Americans, Black Americans. So the NSAL, one of the key features is that it also has an oversampling of Caribbean Americans as well. Then we have the Ad Health, which is what I'll be calling it, the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adulthood Health. And that one is a longitudinal study that started following teenagers into adulthood. And now they're roughly in their late 30s to early 40s. They started in high school. And then in Jackson Hart's study, which tends to be an older population. For today, we're going to focus on the first two data sets because I wanted to share the data that we've either already published or are in the process of developing those manuscripts. And this is just the overall information. So as you can see, these are robust data sets. So anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 overall in a sample. Now, granted, once we start dealing with missing data, and it drops down quite a bit, but it's still very large samples, even with that type of attrition. So why am I so obsessed with denominations? One of the issues that we were having is that when we were looking at existing research is that you would have these robust comparisons of the religious affiliations for white Americans in health studies. And then it would be the Black church. So you would have either an all white sample or you'd have a multiracial sample, but it would be white people of a lot of different faiths, and the Black people would just be the Black church. And I can understand that because the majority of African Americans are members of historically Black churches. But if you dig deeper into that, as this table or these charts show, the 7 largest historically Black churches are listed here: AME, AME Zion, CME, Kojic, which is part of the Pentecostal faith group, Baptist, United Methodist Church, and Presbyterian Church. And then there's also, and not all of these were created like the AME Church as by Black people, but they have large Black populations as part of their membership. And then as well as others which may be more regional, having large Black populations, for instance, Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventist, or Catholic. Now, one of the issues that you have, we're dealing with secondary data. And so with some of the data sets, what we found is that either the researchers didn't ask for these specific denominations or they grouped them together, particularly around Methodist. We found that Methodists were often grouped together as well as the various Pentecostal groups. And then for the National Survey of American Life, they did the most disconcerting thing of all, and they lumped folks together in a group called Protestant Other, which doesn't really give you a lot of good information. But we did get great information on Catholics, Presbyterians, as well as Pentecostals, of course, Baptist, and Methodist. And we had some interesting findings with Lutherans, but we couldn't really report on a lot of that just for sample size issues. So our team, we have a really strong team, an interdisciplinary team to help us inform our research questions as well as our analysis and as we go further. So I wanted to make sure I acknowledge that, and later on I have pictures. So I wanted to kind of get into the thick of things as far as the key findings and the trends. So as I said, we were studying obesity, diabetes, depression, and hypertension. And just to give you some ideas about some of our, about why we were looking obesity, I wanted to bring up specifically because that is such a big issue, and particularly for Black women. you can see that for when it comes to for Black women, you have the highest prevalence of obesity. Overall, women in general tend to have higher rates of obesity, but when you're talking about Black women, that is really high, especially in comparison to the overweight category. And you can see by age on that second chart, when you separate it by age, that also there are different time periods of your life when you're expected to peak or when you're expected to have a lower weight. And this was something that is from the CDC data. So when we were looking at our data, we were finding some things that were pretty intriguing. So this paper was released in 2019. And one of the things that we found was that there were two things. Now, when it got out to the Duke machine, it got very interesting. So we found for Black men specifically, the finding that most people latched on to was that men who attended church almost daily, that they were significantly more likely to be obese than their counterparts who never attended church, which of course, when the media picked it up, it's church making you fat. And so those interviews were interesting because that's not exactly what we were saying. What we actually felt was that, and this is where some of the interpretation that we're going, hopefully the insight we'll be able to get from the qualitative data, but just based off of both research and then I grew up in the church, and from what I see, as far as being in the church, when you're going to church that much, it doesn't really leave a lot of room for anything else. And that's really what we were thinking about. Because if you think about someone who's working, and oftentimes, if you're going to church that often, you have a leadership role in your church. So you're going to church 3 days a week, you go to work, you may pick up kids or look in on a family member, you go to Bible study, you might have a deacon's meeting or something else. And then by the time you've done all that, it's 9 o'clock at night. And on your way home, you are just picking up whatever's open. So that's really what we were thinking about. What I was actually surprised, which was the novel finding in this study, because there has been some research that's looked at the obesity for Black men in its relationship to church attendance. And that was really about the diabetes. And that was something that we haven't really been able to explain why. It was more so like, hey, we found this. We hope somebody can help us interpret it. And it'll be interesting to get your take on that. So this next study is, actually, is that one? This next study, I realized that that I put it in my notes. So this study right here, looking at denomination, gender, and life stage, we looked at the intersection of gender and age, and we separated the groups by denomination. And what we found is that for women, and obviously, like I said, these are all African Americans. For women, what we found is that it wasn't just denomination and it wasn't just age, but the intersection of denomination and the intersection of denomination and age had a big effect on obesity. And for what we found is that for women who were Pentecostal, who were in that 30-year age range, they actually had significantly higher obesity than the other groups, specifically Baptist and Methodist. And for one of those, it was about 3 times as high. Now, this is something that is actually very interesting because as I showed you from this chart, in the general population, you find that age period of your 20s and 30s to be a time when you're at your lowest weight. The other thing that we found, particularly for Pentecostal women, is that there was no flattening of of their um, of their levels of obesity or likelihood of being obese. Is probably a more accurate way of saying it. So their risk of obesity never actually had a leveling down point. And so that's something that should be looked into more. And I'll talk about a bit more about my thoughts on that in a few minutes. So this paper has been accepted and hopefully will be out sometime in the next few months. So the next paper looking at hypertension, this used AdHealth data. And then once again, we found a vulnerability with Pentecostal women. And so this is a trend that we need to look into. The other aspect about this paper, and ironically, this was an issue that I got pushed back on when it came to the NIH reviewers, is how young this sample is. So one of the critiques, or one of the things I had to account for in this study, was how, why are you using AdHealth when you're looking at something? And I think they actually even talked specifically about hypertension, and they said it's not going to show up. So as we started analyzing the data, the first thing that stood out to us was that roughly 30% of the participants actually rated as having hypertension, which is unusual, and it was surprising. So there was already a higher prevalence in this participant pool for hypertension. And then once we started looking more deeply into this, and this article was just published in October. Yeah, well, I guess it came out in November, December. And so, so what we find is this intersection of gender and denomination. And so every time we're looking, oftentimes when we're looking, just the straight denominational differences were either weak or non-existent. There was no significant difference. But once we looked more deeply into it and disaggregated the data by race by gender and age, or gender and denomination, that was what we actually found. And so for AdHealth, they also looked at coping style, and that it was showing that religious coping also had an influence on hypertension as well. So this is, really interesting data. Now, one thing that I was expecting to find as far as what are the things that could influence the findings was, I assumed that maybe the Pentecostal women were attending church significantly more than the other groups, but we weren't really finding that. There weren't significant differences across church attendance based off of denomination in the study. So that was something that was interesting, especially as how it informs our findings. And then for depression, this article just came out in December. And so the article is based, that you see here, Shades of Black. This article is using the NSAL data, and then we have an article that's recently been submitted that is using the AdHealth data. So so that is the AdHealth data is a separate manuscript. So with this NSAL data, like I said, which is a national sample of African Americans and a pretty wide age range. The thing that was really striking is, as I said earlier, in general, you have a gender gap when it comes to depressive symptoms, with women, with women having greater depression, more likely to have depressive symptoms than men. What we found is that when we looked at denomination, the gaps between men and women differed based off of denomination. So, and where even for some of them where the men actually had higher rates or higher likelihood or odds of depressive symptoms than the women, which was an interesting finding, particularly for Catholics. And then for the ad health data, what we found, the key finding we had for that was that Catholic women reported more depressive symptoms than Baptist women and non-denominational women. And there were no differences in the groups that aren't listed here. And so there are a few theories that we have about both of these sets of findings. So some of it has to do with the gender norms depending on the denomination. One of the reasons why I was so interested in looking at gender specifically, I grew up predominantly going to the AME church, but you go to other churches in your community, and other family members may go to different denominations, and the gender roles were just so starkly different about who could be a leader, how you could express yourself, how you could dress, that I couldn't imagine that would not also have an impact on things such as depression and other health indicators. And our findings revealed that to also be true. So, so I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge the big team that we have, particularly my postdocs. So we have Paul Robbins, Melissa Scott, and our former postdoc, Lanika Blackman-Carr. And then our demographer, Alhenia Conde, who really put all this together. And we have undergrads, we have graduate students, as well as, like I said, a really big team of advisors and stakeholders that are part of this. So getting back into what does it all mean? The key issue that we want to be able to say is that denominations matter. Oftentimes, when we talk about the Black community or the Black church, it doesn't really acknowledge the diversity in beliefs. So even though the majority of Black people hold strong religious beliefs, it doesn't mean that all of them have the same beliefs. So in the US, there's roughly about 80,000 historically Black churches across the country. So it would be strange for there not to be differences when you're starting to talk about, educational levels, gender dynamics that I mentioned before. One thing I would also be interested in is the size of churches. I imagine there would be differences, and this is outside the scope of this study, when it comes to a mega church versus a storefront church. There's a lot of variation in there, and a lot of really untapped work that can be done in this area. So denominations matter, but denominations really, really matter for women. And we really need to look at the age and gender intersections. Also, attendance matters, but there is a nuance when it comes to how it matters differently for women, and especially in the context of coping. On depression, we need to check on Catholics. When it comes to obesity and hypertension, we need to check on Pentecostal women. And then also the gender gap is something that was also a key and critical issue. But what I wanted to make sure I came back to was the Pentecostal women. And this is a group that I feel is untapped as far as looking specifically, because oftentimes when we look at faith-based interventions specifically, it may be started at one specific church and it's successful, and then you take it to the next Black church up the street without having the nuance of the social norms and the cultural norms within that faith institution that may be different based off of denomination. And so when you're talking about Black Pentecostals, typically you're talking about the Church of God in Christ. Um, and even within the Church of God in Christ, you still have several more historically Black denominations. And there's certain lifestyle doctrines, and lifestyle is used pretty loosely, that can inform some of our findings. And so some of that has to do with the ideas of modesty and vanity as being something that you don't want to really engage in. And especially the idea of vanity being tied into health and exercise. If you think about the way that we often associate exercise with how you look instead of your overall health, it can at times be in opposition to your views if you feel that vanity is something that you should not uphold or put an emphasis on. Now, one thing that is very specific is looking at this book by Judith Castleberry, whose work I really admire. This book is based off a qualitative study and observational and interviews that she did with women in the Church of God in Christ and in the Pentecostal church. And these are the more traditional conservative Pentecostal women. She was showing heavy service expectations in that 25 to 50 year range, where at that age you are expected to be the person to open up the church, clean the church before and after service, handle food. You're handling several ministries. There's just a heavy emphasis, but there's also an underlying culture to the strong Black woman paradigm and framework, and that this struggle and sacrifice is part of a demonstration of your faith. And so I thought that was a really interesting way to interpret our findings. And then I would also look at Shanika Walker Barnes' work, her book, Too Heavy a Yoke. And that looks overall at Black women in church. And I believe she is actually an alum of Duke. And so these are things that I feel really need more interrogation and deeper thought as far as how we interpret our findings. Because one thing I wanted to be clear about, this study is not about bashing churches, it's not about bashing Pentecostals. It's really like, how can we integrate people's faith in a way that can feed their soul, feed them spiritually, but also make sure that their vessel is whole as well. And so that's something that I've been really, thinking about and trying to figure out how we can determine these next steps. And so limitations, there's always limitations with secondary data. We had to deal with some consolidated denominations. The NSAL is although it's a robust data set, it is an older data set. And then the next steps, as I told you, we're collecting primary qualitative data. So one of the things that we wanted to do with the quantitative data, we wanted to know if there were relationships between these variables. And we're using the qualitative data to do two things: to understand why these relationships exist in real life, but also like, do these relationships that we're finding even in these specific denominations, is that reflective of what you're seeing in your own faith communities? And then we need to publish our Jackson Hart study findings, which are also coming out soon. And so with that in mind, I really wanted to open up for questions, and I'll stop sharing, but I'm easy to find and easy to contact. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bentley Edwards, both for that really important and engaging presentation, and for giving us quite a bit of time to talk and conversation with one another, which is a real joy.
Yes.
So I'll moderate the Q&A and keep an eye on folks if you'll raise hands in the participant function. I'll call on you then, and we'll invite you to turn on your video and unmute yourself and engage in that way. So feel free to go ahead and raise hands in the chat if you have a question. First question, Dr. Farr-Curlin.
Okay, I think I'm now unmuted.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Bentley Edwards. I'm wondering if there's data on that's longitudinal such that you could tell whether people become more obese or their obesity levels change differentially based on what kind of church they join or moving from one church to the other. Because and maybe a corollary question is, if you could speak to, is the issue of confounding. Knowing roughly that Pentecostals are, I think in general, have a lower socioeconomic status on average, lower levels of education. Wondering whether obesity is correlated with that, and that is correlated with denomination, and that might explain the difference. Your thoughts about that?
So for the quantitative, so there's two things. So we are actually running analysis now on a longitudinal with the AdHealth data to see if there's changes over time. Now, one thing there with a caveat. So part of the issues when you're dealing with secondary data, sometimes they'll ask the questions slightly differently from one round to the next as far as religion. So we can see how the arc of their obesity, but we can't always see if their religion changed at that point. So because if they ask something that if it's a category that may have been dropped, then it may not catch, or if they decided to pick it up later, we may not be able to catch that all the time. So that's something that I wanted to make sure I made that distinction on. The other aspect we did control, I didn't want to beat you guys over the head with a whole bunch of statistics because I really wanted to have the nuance, but we did control for income in all of our analyses. So we controlled for income and also for educational status. And then one of the things that we thought may also be related had to do with region. And there really weren't, on the NSAL, there were some regional differences when it came to obesity, but it wasn't where you would expect based off of what you see on the news. The South wasn't necessarily heavier than everyone else. And, considering that, which somewhat in a lot of ways, it can kind of make sense as far as most Black people are in the South in the US, but it's not, but they weren't necessarily a heavier group for these national samples. Thank you, great questions.
Great, thank you both. I think I see next Thomas Holcomb.
Hi, yes, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Bentley Edwards. My question, a couple questions, and if it's don't want to be too deep on the theological levels, but you mentioned there the Presbyterian Church. That's a very broad category, referring more to church polity than church theology. So I wonder if you had broken down that data into different denominations, like within the Presbyterian Church or within the Baptist Church, with respect to like Reformed doctrine. And then another question, and you don't have to answer all my questions, but these are my thoughts. Views of eschatology, of the end times, and specifically of the body, if that had any role in people's view of their own bodies, like if you're going to have the same body, the resurrected body, or a new body, would that play
a
any
brand
role?
new, yeah. You're born brand new, yes.
And then finally, my other thought I had was you mentioned how people might be busy during the day. If church attendance went up on the daily basis 3 times a week, might they be more obese? And so did you match that at all for non-religious people who had similar busy schedules? And do they match up in that regard as well? Adjusted for age and demographics and education, so on and so forth.
So let's see. So the first question, with the Presbyterian, because it was secondary data, we couldn't necessarily break it up. That was a frustration with the Presbyterian group, Pentecostal group, as well. Oh, I mixed I love your coworker, the Presbyterian group, as well as the Methodist. The Methodist group, we were also, really disappointed that because there's a big difference between someone who's United Methodist versus Annie or Annie Zion. So that was a frustration that we had as well when it came to the secondary data. And so we're hoping that as we can choose with the qualitative data, to be able to pick up the pieces of some of those denominations that were missing from the quantitative data. So that was the number one. The other aspect, as far as the afterlife, that couldn't really be picked up in the quantitative. They didn't really ask specific questions about it. It was more so about overall coping and faith. So is whether or not, I just leave it up to God. And then some of my conversations with faith leaders, and this was part of us forming the research questions, is not so much in dealing with the afterlife, but more so worrying about your health was also seen as not having a strong enough faith. And so God will provide, on different ends of the spectrum. And so I'm just going to pray over it and hope for the best. But then you also have the other end. If you were to talk about Adventists, who it's very much a part of their doctrine. The other thing that we're interested in when it comes to the qualitative data are the different types of health ministries and that churches may have. So for me, if I were just to divide like the two, I guess there would be three extremes or three big data points when it comes to what may be in a health ministry. So obviously it could be either nothing, or it could be something that is more so like an informational, or awareness based. So like heart health awareness is February. And then down to the other end of the spectrum where you have workout activities, you have cooking classes, you have blood pressure checks, once a month or on a regular basis. So I think that those are some of the things when it comes to the afterlife and how that is related to how people take care of their bodies in their present form, I think will come up in the qualitative data. So I think that's a great question.
Thank you, Thomas, and thanks especially to your coworker. The next question is from Jason Ash, my friend and TMC alum.
Hello, hello, good afternoon. Sorry, I'm gonna hide myself. I hate to look at that. Okay, great. So thank you so much for this amazing talk. I feel, first of all, well, I have so many thoughts, but I feel like I do not get to see enough Black researchers who are also talking about the ways that we are not monolithic. So the first thing I wrote down is just thanking you for recognizing that the Black church is not monolithic and that we are unique, but most of the literature tries to position us as speaking to a culture of racism and how that intersects with faith, but they also then miss how there are other manifestations of denominational differences. So thank you.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Now you're gonna hit me with the hard question. I can tell it's coming. I'm ready for it.
Sorry, I'm geeking out on a Wednesday. So I have two questions. The first is about candidate mediators. So particularly when you say church size, the first thing I thought about was social support. But even when I was more active in my church in Durham, I remember being a part of the church choir, and a lot of ways that we would gather and celebrate and fellowship with each other was over a meal. And so and we were in a Pentecostal space, right? So it's just very interesting to see how that's showing up. So I was wondering how did y'all, if y'all tested for candidate mediators like alcohol use, other health behaviors? And then the other follow-up was with regard to the difference between religious coping and religious service attendance. If there were ways that you could tease through the positive versus the negative religious coping, and even thinking through the, I think in response to Thomas's point too, that sometimes you'll hear language of pray it away, or I put it all in God's hands, which in my opinion is both negative but also positive, because Black folks
absolutely.
Right, like we've had to deal with racism and everything. So at this point, it's like, I can't worry about this right now. I need to, you know. And so I think that passing stuff on to God is also a positive thing for us, but most of literature characterizes it negative. So I just wanted to hear some thoughts with regards to that. And thank you again.
Yes, no, that's great. It's like you've been in our research meetings. So, so for the, so I'll start backwards. So with the religious coping, it is both. It's a both and situation, right? So and it can be very helpful on things that truly are out of your control, right? So you can actually stop and you say, you know what? And in a semi-structured way, I talked about this right before this. I was like, look, once I submit something, I'm like, hey, it's out of my hands, you know. And that's kind of so I guess my faith follows on that too. I'm like, hey, you know, it's submitted. You know, I don't think about it anymore. But I look at that in other ways too, in how you deal with challenging people, how that can also be helpful. Like, I can't control you, I'm gonna leave that one up to God. I think that can also be very helpful in a lot of ways. But when it comes to, there's two things. So where it can be harmful when there are things that you possibly can control, but it's with a caveat. You also have to have a support system that allows you to engage in those behaviors too. So, you know, the food aspect, you know, one of my very best friends, born and raised Pentecostal, and she'd go to church, she'd get there at about 12 o'clock and she wouldn't get home till about 10 at night. But you know, she'd have food breaks in between, and you know, sometimes it was healthy and sometimes, you know, it was some good mac and cheese. Now, one of the things I want to argue with is that we will not make that argument that someone indulging on Sunday afternoon on traditional Southern food is going to make them obese if they are engaging in other behaviors the rest of the week, right? So it doesn't, I don't want to demonize, you know, Miss Pearl's cooking. What I'm saying is that you can't eat Miss Pearl's cooking every day. You know, you have to slip in a salad. So that's more so the perspective that I have, is that because first off, most churches can't afford to feed you every time you come in if you are coming in every night or for multiple ministries. And so that's something else, like, as far as the perception that people have about church culture. Yes, there is often food, but it's not necessarily, everything is not, you know, the big mama's house type cooking. Let's see, that was your last question. You had something else and I got too hyped and I forgot what it was. Can you repeat it? Oh wait, I think you're muted.
Okay, sorry.
Hey,
Yeah,
no problem.
no, I think I've now messed up my paper, so I can't read my notes. So that was
Okay.
That was helpful. I'll follow up. Thank you, though. Thank you.
Yes, and if it might come back to me. Hopefully, it won't be at 2 o'clock in the morning. But if it comes back to me, I'll answer it. Or if it comes back to you, you can just send me a note.
Oh, well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Jason. Thank you both. Next, I see Rebecca Hamblett.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bentley Edwards. Thank you so
Hello.
much. This was an awesome talk. I am a nursing student from Villanova University, and I am really interested in health promotion and public health nursing. And so I know that you touched on this a couple of questions ago, but I was wondering if you could share more about some of those. I know a lot of public health projects partner with different faith-based organizations. And so I was wondering if in your research, if you came across any programs and if you guys saw a difference in their health outcomes depending on like the health problem of the denomination, whether it was hypertension or depression, if those programs were effective, and if so, how those might be implemented in other churches. Thank you.
Yes, no, great. See, that's a great question. That actually was part of what motivated the study, was the frustration. As the more we kept digging in, a lot of times the churches, the faith-based programs, when they went into churches, they actually didn't give the details. They just said a Black church or a Black church in the community. Oftentimes they didn't even say what the denomination was, or they may have talked about it in the pilot study that was published, but then they didn't talk about it further along. But then you find mixed. So if you look at the best practices, like the What Works page, I think it's the National Cancer Institute has the best functioning one. If you look, there's really not a lot to go by. And what you find is that part of it is that scalability is challenged. And what I would make the argument is that the problems of scalability has to do in the Black church, where there's a bit more success in the white church. And the white church, obviously, also acknowledging the diversity in the white faith community, is that I think that the white faith community was considered before they went into a different denomination. So if they were going to mainline Protestant, if they started in mainline Protestant, they were looking for other mainline Protestants. That's my guess on that. So that's what that's where I would look, is to look at the National Cancer Institute's What Works site to see what is the most recent, because my thoughts are a little bit outdated on that. But that's where I would go if I were you. And you can specifically query for faith-based programs. And I love Philly. I went to Penn. So.
Thank you both. Dr. Bentley, I wonder if you could say a bit about the qualitative work that y'all are looking to do or getting started. I'm really interested in what you're pursuing and how you're pursuing it.
So we partnered up with the Community Health Coalition. And we did this for a few reasons. For one, when we submitted the grant, I just moved here. I'd only been here for a few months. And one thing I do know is that if you're going to do work in the community, you need to have either be from the community or you need to be partnered up with a strong institution. And for them, they're so, and especially with Dr. Elaine Hart Brothers, she's so connected with the faith community here that it was a natural partnership. And so obviously with COVID, it threw a monkey wrench, so to speak, in our plans. We were supposed to have started really about this time last year, but that was put on pause. And so we've started doing everything virtually. So we were asking questions to faith leaders about, so although there's a lot of overlap between the interview questions and the focus group questions, there are some that are a bit more pointed for the faith leaders, because we would assume that they'd have a deeper understanding of doctrine. You know, not necessarily, because I do have some aunts who can tell you some things, but the assumption would be that the faith leaders may have a better explanation for why their approach to health is the way that it is in their faith community. For some of them, we tell a few of our findings to kind of see if it reflects what they see in their church community. But we also want to know, like, do you talk about it on the pulpit? Do you, and also for the other key is that for the qualitative, we also are looking to look at Muslim, African-American Muslims in, North Carolina, and Durham specifically has a pretty large African-American Muslim community, and with a long history, which is pretty exciting. And that is something that is also unique about Durham, is that we have a longstanding historically Black Catholic church, as well as Presbyterian and Lutheran, Seventh-day Adventist. Like, we have just a real richness in faith from a historically Black perspective here that I really enjoy.
Thank you for that. And I'm really excited about the fruits of both that qualitative research and your overall project and all the different things you have running. It's just really exciting to learn about this work that you're doing and to learn from it, and also to imagine potential ways that we can partner in the future. I'm really excited about that.
Yes.
So thank you on behalf of all of TMC for joining us and leading us in this conversation. It's a real joy to learn from you, Dr. Bentley Edwards. For those of you in attendance, please know that our next TMC seminar will be in 2 weeks on February 24th with Dr. Kavin Rowe and Dr. Bradley Gregory, two biblical studies scholars, speaking on Saved by Grace Through Pharma, the Bible and Preventive Medicine. So please do join us then. But for now, please join me in thanking Dr. Bentley Edwards one last time for her presentation.